we hadn't talked about this before the interview. How are you feeling after announcing that you're choosing not to run for re-election?
I'm feeling more than anything else that I have to make sure that I push on through the end of the year and the end of the term, and just make sure that everybody in the office feels the same level of security and stability in doing their job. At the end of the day, the job is a leadership job, and you have to lead people right up until the last minute. So for me, there isn't much of a change in my approach to things. This has been a pretty intense focus for over 30 years now, whether as an assistant DA or as the elected DA. I've just brought a very high degree of passion and attention to the job, so that hasn't changed.
What has the reaction been from outside folks coming, whether it be texting you, reaching out, emailing you after the news broke Friday afternoon?
People have been wonderful, and they've always been wonderful. They're supportive when there's bad times. They're supportive when there's good times. But overall, what I have heard from people is simply gratitude for the public service, and all I ever say in return is it's my privilege, and that's the truth. That isn't just a talking point or some throwaway tagline. For me, this role, this responsibility has always just been a privilege. It's allowed me to work with some of the finest people in public service. What it reminds me a lot of is when I first started in public service, when I joined the Army and eventually became commissioned as an infantry officer. I was just surrounded by totally committed people that were just really good people who just believed in the mission and the ideals and the principles of the country and wanted to serve. And so that's the privilege that I've had for the last 30 years in this office.
Yeah. How did you come to this decision?
It's a decision that you have to discuss with your family, and particularly my wife. She's been in this with me from day one, and it's oftentimes put a toll on her as well. And we just felt that this was an opportune time to do it. I feel that the office is in a position of stability, particularly coming out of the last budget cycle, and for the first time, the ADAs are going to be compensated at a reasonable level, and the county has some flexibility now with the sales tax. That I just feel that there's, for the first time, actually since I've been elected, I actually feel that there's some longer term stability. And I've been doing this for 30 years, and I do believe that there's some real benefit to having somebody new take over and bring their own energy and passion to something.
It is pretty unique in Milwaukee County. I mean, since the 1960s, there's been two of you.
That's right.
One person and you. Obviously, you're an elected official, so that clearly says a lot about your stature and the way that you've been running this office with folks in Milwaukee County, continuously re-electing you to be a part of that legacy with just, two elected officials in the office in the last, here's my math, 60, 40,
yeah, that's
60 years almost.
John, it actually goes beyond that, believe it or not. So the district attorney that was elected in 1945 was here. His name was Macaulay, another Irishman, and he was here until 65. And then there was a brief period where there were two other DAs just for very brief periods of time, and then Mike McCann, and he was here for 38 years. And then of course I was hired by Mike, and I took over from Mike. But the one thing that's remained the same, and what motivated me to get into elected politics, was the fact that every single assistant DA that's joined this office since 1969 has just been given the same basic mission and principle, which is just do the right thing to the best of your ability on every case. Do justice. Be a minister of justice. Don't worry about the politics. Don't worry about any criticisms that may occur in both sense. In other words, if you can prove the case, you move forward, and if you can't, you don't. And so that fundamental obligation to do justice in a principled and ethical way is what attracts me, and I think the people that want to do this kind of service the right way. So Now, having said that, there's also a unique opportunity to serve the community in ways that go beyond the courtroom,
Yeah.
right? So we have a nationally recognized community partnership program. Oftentimes we refer to it as the community prosecution program, but that's been a unique aspect of the office that we've been able to actually get to know people right at the neighborhood level and let them identify what the problems are and let us work collaboratively with them to try to solve those problems.
Right.
Our relationship in evolving the way we deal with domestic violence and family violence with Sojourner Family Peace Center, again, that's transformed the approach that we take. We don't look on each individual incident as just a one-off. We think, what's the impact on the kids?
Right.
What's the impact on the neighborhood, the entire family structure? And developing that one-stop approach for the entire family with Sojo has been huge. Focusing on victims, right? The expansion of our witness protection program and trying to make sure that victims can partake in the justice system without intimidation, without fear, without retaliation. That's been a critical. And then just maintaining the high excellence in the most high profile and intense types of cases, which are obviously the homicides,
Right.
the sexual assaults,
Violent crimes,
the violent crimes, and quite frankly, the work that's done out at Children's Court is elevated of importance because what you're talking about is the future. And so you have to make sure that you have the very best people working on the children in need of protective services, the termination of parental rights, and the delinquencies. So those are the things that I've been the proudest of being able to not only secure them, but in many ways actually strengthen them over the years.
I think other people have noticed that. That's one of the things that Mosley brought up when I talked to him on Friday was your ability to not just, come into the office, sit at your desk, go into the courtroom, and come back. You have been actively out in the community. You've put prosecutors out, in police districts, working directly with victims' families. Why was that a priority for you?
What I had seen as a line prosecutor, and that's the difference, is I was in fact a line prosecutor for 12 years before I ran, and I was dealing with primarily the violent crime offenses. And I believe strongly that the work we did here could influence the conditions out in the community. However, what we did here was after the damage had already been done, right? And so I had the fortune of working with the Medical College of Wisconsin, Dr. Steve Hargarten, and he challenged me when I first developed the Firearms Enforcement Unit back in 1999. He challenged me. He said, "This is great. I understand that this is a deterrence model. You're going to aggressively prosecute people that misuse firearms, and that's great." He goes, "What are you going to do to prevent it?" And I said, That's a great question, Doc, and the answer is, I don't know.
Right.
But that took me on a journey from there, and the answer has become that there's limits to what you can do, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't have a dramatic impact on some of those dynamics if you actually help shape some of the interventions early on and identify the problem early on, come up with a thoughtful intervention and execute that, and then that tends to keep a lot of the high profile emergency room type situations under control. Now, having said that, and again, I can point to the success of that model, but then there's some things you can't control, and certainly the impact of the pandemic on the entire system is still profound. But there's no question that it derailed so many of those efforts for at least a 2 to 3 year period. I would argue we're just coming out of it now. We're getting there. I would anticipate by the end of the year we'll kind of be in that equilibrium, which I simply mean not that everything is perfect. What it means is that you have enough space to start doing some of the proactive work again.
Okay.
And then that feeds upon itself, and the more proactive you are, the fewer reactive things you have to do.
We've seen interesting waves of crime, violent crime, from before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, and now, I guess, are we after the pandemic at this point?
Yeah.
Where, now we're seeing a downtrend, which is great in violent crime. from your perspective, how do you think courts can be more efficient when it comes to prosecuting those during those waves of kind of high tide, low tide, of, who is going to be prosecuted and then who deserves a second chance, to not really, overwhelm the justice system to a state where we saw during the pandemic?
That's a great question. And one of the ways you do that is you really commit to what we have committed to in Milwaukee with our Community Justice Council. And that means that you actually meet with the leadership and the stakeholders in the criminal justice system and in the community, and you develop priorities. And one of those priorities is just what I said, is everybody acknowledges that it would be a better system if those with mental illness, for example, are not scooped into the system and put into a confined setting and just sit there for months on end waiting for some process to unfold that's not going to make them healthy. The same thing, the same understanding is that we have to keep the community safe. So you have to keep that balance in mind. You have to work with your law enforcement partners, and we have always done that as well. As you mentioned, the fact that we have oftentimes had our community partners co-located in police, not always. Another national model is the work we do with the Near West Side neighborhood, which is a consortium of institutions and stakeholders in the Near West Side that actually help fund one of our community partners there. But same with the downtown bid. But we have never taken an anti-police attitude, because that doesn't make any sense any more than I would ever take an anti-community attitude, because the community itself is not anti-police. They don't want bad policing. They don't tolerate misconduct by police officers, nor do we. And so the understanding has always been that we have to work together. Ideally, you identify the relatively small number of people that are engaged in violent crime, and then you try to focus on them and remove them in a constitutionally appropriate way from the community, so that the rest of the community can live lives of peace and prosperity without worrying about their security every day.
Yeah. You've gotten a lot of attention for, as we've talked about already, restorative justice programming, implementing the low bail reform here in the county. Why was that a focus for you, and how do you think it impacted Milwaukee County?
Well, it was part of an approach that said that we should identify people that pose a risk to the community and treat them differently than people that were coming in for a combination of reasons. Are they coming in because they are alcohol or drug addicted? Are they coming in because they suffer from mental illness? Are they coming in because they've just been exposed to a lot of abuse and trauma over the years, and they're not making really smart decisions? One thing that's oftentimes misunderstood is my diversion programs and the restorative justice programs, we were always pretty clear that you were not eligible if you'd committed a violent offense, right? That just wasn't, you were pretty much off the list of eligibility for that. But what it did do is it actually created the space within the system where you could focus the system's resources, the traditional resources, the courtroom experience, for the people that were committing violent offenses. The other people, you wanted to actually get some form of intervention treatment out in the community if possible. And so, and one of the things with restorative justice and trying to make victims whole is what we found is we were able to actually get millions and millions of dollars back to victims long before you would traditionally do it if you just prosecuted in the traditional form. Because we'd always put that as a priority. If it was, if you had broken in and stolen somebody's snowblower with a snowstorm coming, right? I mean, these things, you break into somebody's car and you steal their computer. Anytime that we could actually get restitution to the victim up front, that went a long ways to healing the issue, healing the harm that had occurred.
A victim-first approach.
It was a victim-first approach.
Yeah. I want to go through a couple of cases that came across your desk in your specifically as you were DA in the last 18 years. First is Derrik Williams. I'm sure some of these names ring bells, of course, for you when they're brought up. Died in the back of a MPD squad car back in July of 2011. You made the decision to reopen this case and assign a special prosecutor to see if there were going to be charges brought against the officer in Williams's death. You seem to have made a point as DA for you and your prosecutors to only charge if they can prove beyond a reasonable doubt in the court. Is there anything that you would have changed in this case?
On that particular case, no, because if you remember, the decision to reopen was based on a reevaluation by the medical examiner.
Right.
Which means that I have to re-examine it,
Right.
quite frankly. And because I've already made a determination and gone public with it,
Right.
I now have to even step back from that and see if I can bring somebody in independent. And again, there's no, the only pride in ownership is when you get it right? So there, if somebody comes forward with new information and you're concerned that maybe your previous bias might impact the decision, just bring somebody else from the outside in to take a look at it. As it turns out, that special prosecutor ultimately came to the same conclusion as I had come to the first time.
Right.
But it was useful in terms of always just going that extra step to make sure to, whenever possible, that you were making the right call.
Was it hard when the medical examiner came back and said, wait a second, we don't think this was a natural death, we think this was a homicide?
It's always hard, because you have to remember that as part of my commitment to the community, I never make a decision like this without sitting down with the family first. I just don't, and that oftentimes those are very difficult conversations. If I've determined I can't prove a crime was committed,
Right.
then I understand the anger, the frustration, the hurt, but you do that the first time, and you're hoping that you're not going to have to do it again. And so, yes, I mean, that's one of those cases where you think about, again, more from the family's perspective. The one thing that you hope for in this system is finality. You don't always get it, but that's what you're seeking, is finality.
Do you think the family got that in this case?
I don't know that they would ever feel that way. And I think again, putting myself in their shoes from their perspective, I wouldn't feel any different myself.
I feel like finality is hard to come by.
That's it. Yeah.
Especially when, in some cases you don't get a clear-cut answer, or the answer that, one party was hoping for, something like that.
No, that's right. And so many of our cases that are close calls, anything that involves any pre-existing medical condition or the ingestion of drugs during the encounter. Look, you're finding even nationwide the cases are now being re-examined as the medical data and experience changes over time as well. What you're often left with is just the professional decision based on the facts that they have at that time.
Right.
And I have to tell that to the families often as well, is that if there was in fact an incident that resulted in death, that we can always look at that again.
Yeah. Another situation is Corey Stingley. He was the teenager at the West Ellis convenience store who was caught stealing beverages, approached by the cashier and then 3 other men in that store. They detained him until police got there. He was unconscious by the time police arrived. Your office at the time said that you didn't believe there was enough evidence to prove that these men were responsible based off of lack of surveillance footage, witness statements, etc. Do you still think that is the case, and do you still believe that there was not enough proof in this case?
Yeah, you know what? I won't weigh in one way or the other, because I believe that the Dane County DA is currently looking at the case again.
I was going to say, I think it was just recently brought back up.
Yeah, and so I'm not gonna offer like an ultimate conclusion. What I will say is that based on the information I had at the time, and as in all of these cases, I have zero concerns or problems with another DA's office or an outside review taking a look at it again. But yes, I felt I was working with the most experienced homicide prosecutor in the country at the time. His name was Derrik Williams. We had long discussions of this. The family was represented by an extraordinarily experienced defense attorney who had been a former prosecutor. These discussions, the investigation went on for months. We looked at every possible angle we could. And we even held a John Doe, a public John Doe on that one. We looked at every angle we possibly could. My ultimate conclusion was that there wasn't sufficient evidence to know which of those individuals would have been responsible for the death. And now, since that time, one of the individuals is actually has died, and so it's going to become, that'll be another challenge.
Even more challenging.
Yeah.
Another one is Tre Hamilton. He was asleep on a park bench when officers had already checked on him. Officer Manny with MPD was the next one to approach him, illegally patted him down. Hamilton ended up grabbing his baton. Officer Manny shot him 14 times. It's a hard story to look at, I think, from the public perspective, as well as probably your perspective and the journalistic perspective. I think a lot of questions still loom in this case of, he was obviously fired from the department. He tried to appeal that decision. That decision, was held by the Fire and Police Commission. I think a lot of people still have questions to this day. How, in a case like that, was that officer not charged?
Keep in mind that this would have been 2014, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
yes.
The biggest difference between 2014 and in the present day, is unequivocally body cameras.
Body cam, yeah.
This was a case that cried out for body cameras or video surveillance footage. Anything. You had none of that. It just, to this day, it still stuns me. I brought in probably the preeminent use of force expert in the country. He came to Milwaukee, he walked the scene, he reviewed all the reports. His conclusion was that you would not sustain a conviction against Officer Manny for use of force, for the simple reason that that's the way that Officer Manny had been trained. If that anybody disarmed you and struck you with an instrument that could cause death or great bodily harm, you were authorized under those circumstances to use deadly force. So what you have to evaluate as a prosecutor is, what is the defense attorney's response going to be to the charge against it? And obviously in a case like that, it would have been self-defense. And then again, you have to sometimes educate people. I think people are more familiar with this now than may have been back then. But the operation and mechanics of semi-automatic weapons and how quickly 14 rounds can be discharged and all of those different factors. Having said that, this is just, like I said, a classic case where I would have loved to have been able to see things firsthand, that from the perspective of a body camera.
Yeah.
And it wasn't long after that the Milwaukee Police Department committed. So that's sometimes the other positive thing that comes out of the tragedies, right, is it creates that impetus to do whatever piece of accountability, transparency that you can, and the body cameras are one part. They're not perfect, they're not the be-all, end-all, but they help a long ways, both ways, because they help explain, if you had, for example, seen the force with which Officer Manny had been struck, for example, then you may have said, well, okay, that seems like he's trying to cause him serious bodily harm, maybe lose consciousness, something like that. Or if you took a swing and completely missed him, then you'd say, well, come on now, you didn't really need to use force at that circumstance.
It could completely change the whole situation.
Completely change the circumstance, no question.
Two more that stand out really are your John Doe investigations, which a lot of other states don't have the ability to do. The first one was the investigation that resulted in 6 convictions of Scott Walker's aides and associates. Looking back, what stands out to you most about that case, and would you change anything? Yeah,
what stands out the most about that case is that it was really a fairly straightforward investigation into the misuse of county resources in ways that they weren't intended and were actually prohibited by law from being used. That investigation moved relatively quickly and resulted in accountability for the individuals involved at the county level. Now the transition occurred to John Doe 2, where some of the same players were involved, but it was a very different circumstance. And the most significant difference is, even though some of the information that led into John Doe 2 was gathered during John Doe 1, it was beyond my jurisdiction in Milwaukee County at that
Right.
point in time.
Yeah.
It was now a matter of statewide interest.
And it got statewide interest.
Oh, no question. It got statewide interest. And so we brought in a special prosecutor again to look at that independently. And the matter was essentially stopped at the investigation level
Right.
before it reached its culmination. So look, what I would say is that you look back in retrospect, I don't think anybody, at the heart of all of this is just transparency and accountability, right? And if you look back at that time to the present day, I don't know of anybody in politics on either side that actually thinks that elections and the influence of money is less than it was back then. I think everyone would kind of categorically agree that it's pervasive now,
Yep.
and that it is not particularly well controlled or well regulated. And the concern you get with that is that that opens democracy up to skepticism, and you don't want that. You want people to believe that all of their elections are going to be fair, transparent. They're not going to be influenced by people that just have tons and tons of money. I mean, our most recent example, again, I never, in my experience, my first contested, like really highly contested Supreme Court race would have been right around the same time, right? It would have been around the 2010 time period. And, I think we were all scratching our heads when like $1 or $2 million were being thrown into the race at that time. And now
you've got millions.
Now you get up to 50 million just that you know of, right? I mean, just the amount of money that has to be reported. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know that that's good for democracy. I don't know that anybody would ever think it is.
So obviously the Supreme Court had stopped you in this investigation, saying that they didn't believe there was enough evidence that Walker was illegally, working with these groups on elections, et cetera. A lot of Republican Party scrutiny on your half. Do you still believe that there was some evidence? I mean, it sounds like you do, that there was some evidence that led to Scott Walker potentially illegally using groups to recall elections.
So here's the one thing that I do that it may seem naive or even old-fashioned, but I actually, throughout that entire process, took my obligations under the law very, very seriously. And there were no leaks, there were no comments, there was no signaling to anybody what our conclusions were or what facts we had gathered. And I still stick to that today. I think there will come a time when all of that information will be of some strong historical interest. People want to know, but just the fact that and I do correct. Even though I strongly supported the work of the special prosecutor in the sense that we provided investigative resources and things like that. So when people say it was my John Doe, that's okay. I I did strongly support it, even though I did not direct it or control it, right? But I've just been very careful to say that the arguments that we made in public records as to why it was important that it move forward, I stand by those 100%.
You started working in this office as a young prosecutor. Do you still see this office as an admirable opportunity for young lawyers in terms of the role that prosecuting plays in the county, and also the extreme level of scrutiny that comes with this job when you either, charge or don't charge?
This is the greatest job for a government lawyer, hands down. I mean, when you think about it, and when I talk to young attorneys, young people that are thinking about a career as a prosecutor, I tell them that ultimately what we do is we enforce the social compact. And that social compact basically says that we're going to try to maximize your liberty as long as you don't hurt other people and you don't break that compact yourself by hurting other people. In some way, you don't take their property without permission. You don't physically cause them harm. You don't you don't take away their rights, and then they've got to be held accountable, but there's a whole range of ways that you hold them accountable. That's your job as a prosecutor, is to decide how much of the lens of state power is going to be focused on one individual. And when that happens, that can be pretty darn intense. And because at the end of the day, at least in the state of Wisconsin, the ultimate sanction the state has is we can take people's liberty away from them. Right. Now, some states, they can even take your life from you if you live in a death penalty state. But in Wisconsin, the ultimate sanction is to take someone's liberty away from them. I want people to elevate that in their consciousness. I want them to be very certain that when they use the state's power, that they do it in an ethical, principled, and thoughtful way that's based, that uses both their head and their heart. You know, I mean, the thing we tell young prosecutors again is, you know, your job is to do justice, and that's that requires that you balance all of these competing concerns, and that to the best of your ability you make the right call and you stick with it. Yeah.
Talk of the town is Kent Laverne is next. We mentioned this, you know, we talked before we started the interview. Why do you think he would be best to sit in this position next?
There isn't anybody who has done the job of effectively a chief executive officer for the largest prosecutor's office in the state, and quite frankly, one of the largest law firms in the state of Wisconsin. He's done an excellent job with that, but he's done more than that. He really has. I mean, I mentioned our incredible relationship with the Sojourner Family Peace Center. That whole concept from just a kind of a crazy thought, couldn't we do domestic violence service better? That was when he was actually sitting on the board with Sojo, and conversations he had with Carmen, a convening, and that ultimately led to just a revision of how we would approach domestic violence in the community. He's continued to work in many ways to provide the community with access to our office that they may not have had in the past. And so, yeah, I mean, the experience, he clearly would maintain that same level of commitment to the integrity of the office, the principles of the office, and what that experience level that just can't be made up for. Now, having said that, it's an election. It's an election, and so there's never a given. You know, there wasn't a given for me. Right. I ran in a contested race, my first race, and you know, obviously I had the blessing of my predecessor as well, and I was honored to be able to continue that legacy. But everyone's got to make the office their own. They just do. They have to bring their own vision, their own sense of how we best serve the community. And it's going to be a challenging time. I mean, there's just no question about that. This is you know, fraught times is the only way you can describe it. I've been concerned for many years now. It predated the pandemic, but there is an element in the country that simply does not believe in the rule of law, is what I believe, and the only rule of law they believe in is the one that they select for themselves, and that just can't be the way it is. Elections in this country have the first and fundamental rule is that the people that lose accept those results and move on, and try again another time, right? So we've got to make sure we keep that front and center, because if we go away from thinking about that, it's too terrible to contemplate if we start losing what makes this country best, which is, you know, the peaceful transition of power is the bedrock of this democracy.
You read my mind of my next question I was going to ask you is, you know, whoever comes into this office next, what do you think the biggest hurdle for them is going to be when it comes to fighting, prosecuting crime, and getting folks here in Milwaukee County justice?
Well, the biggest challenge has always been sort of internal, external, right? And that is that it was super challenging just to keep and retain super talented, experienced people because the pay was so lousy oftentimes. I think that that's going to start settling down a little bit. The external threats I hope are going to die down as well. In other words, I'm hoping that there isn't this reflexive anti-Milwaukee attitude towards our office and others in like the legislature or other places. I think it's a chance to start over again and move forward. And if me stepping aside facilitates that, then that's a good thing.
Yeah. What's your message to the residents of Milwaukee County after about 3 decades, in this office? This has been your second home for 30 years. What is your message to the people who have supported you, scrutinized you, all of the above?
Just simply how privileged I have been to be in this position, to have earned their trust 5 separate times now, and even before then, to have been given the extraordinary honor of trying to do this work in a principled way with integrity, but also with a sense of this is my community. This is where I've raised my family. This is where I grew up myself. And I feel very, very strongly that every single family in this community should have the same opportunities that I had to grow up in this incredible, wonderful place that we call home. So just gratitude, just a sense of total privilege, and it's just been my honor to serve them.
Yeah. What's next for you?
Don't know. That's going to be. I've got.
You got a year, so you've got some time.
363 days to figure that out.
Yeah,
right?
you've got some time.
But no, I don't know. I'll explore potential academic, maybe nonprofit, potentially some form of government. It wouldn't be as a prosecutor. It's. So there's a whole range. I've got a lot of passion, a lot of energy, and a lot of interest in contributing still, but I just don't know what that's going to be.
Okay, great. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Early congratulations.
And early congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.